This conference will now be recorded.
Just giving everybody one more minute to join us.
Good morning, Derek. This is Travis Lindley.
Hey, good morning. I will ask that if you are not speaking, if you could put your, I see 3 or 4 lines that are open. If you could put your phone on mute, that'll help us not get any feedback. Ross, I think your line might be giving us a little, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I didn't know if you're going to take roll or not. I'll be here with Cassie Moslum, our EMA director. She's right behind me.
Great, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the meeting of the Smyrna Air Quality Oversight Committee. I'm Derek Norton, Mayor of the City of Smyrna. We have with us Councilman Lewis Wheaton is here in the room. Mayor Pro Tem Tim Gould is on the committee, and Travis Lindley has joined us virtually. Are there any other members of council who have joined us that I'd like to recognize?
Derek, this is Glenn Pickens, and I'm one.
Glenn is here too. Okay, great. Thanks for joining us, Glenn. We also have from City of Smyrna staff, our Administrator Joe Bennett, Assistant Administrator Penny Masheri, our Fire Chief Roy Akery. Jennifer Bennett is here, who does all of our community relations, and I don't believe our attorney is here, Scott Cochran. From joining us virtually, I see Lisa Cupid, Kazi Maslum, Kevin Daniel, and Ross Cavett. Dr. Ferguson is on, I believe. Rachel Franklin is on, and here in the room, George McCary, Stephen Nelson, and Fred Kirby. Is there anybody else on the committee that I have missed who has joined us?
Nick Dixon from the Smyrna Business Association.
Thank you, Nick. Anybody else? Okay. we called this meeting this morning after we had, the last one we had was on August 14th. And at that meeting, GHD, who did the air quality sampling for us, presented their findings from the 6 weeks of sampling that we did. I think that, well, first say, I think that they're probably the preeminent source on data. They're probably the best in the business, if not, yeah, they're probably the best in the business at getting that data. But at that, they did that in Willowbrook, Illinois. They've done it here for us both times, and I think that their data is sound. I will say that when they did that presentation, they went a little bit off script and made some conclusions and some assumptions about what that data meant as far as the safety of people in and around Smyrna dealing with air quality. And I wish that that wouldn't have happened, but that is what happened. You know, came to my attention when we met with several residents and other concerned parties that in January, GHD formed a relationship with the Chemistry Council. And so I just feel like we needed to meet again and have an unbiased opinion about, or another opinion about what that data means, somebody with extensive experience in the field. And I'm pleased that we have Dr. Peltier with us today, who will I'll have Chief Acree introduce him. But that's kind of the background of why we're where we are today and why we're having this meeting. You know, we can talk. I want the committee to have an opportunity to have any questions that they have answered, and Dr. Peltier is a great resource. And then it's my intention to have another meeting going forward, and I'm not sure the time frame on it. I'd like to have it coincide with when the EPD sampling results come back, and have some more people at the table and figure out what steps are next from the city of Smyrna specifically, and any action items for this committee. So I'll turn it over to Chief Acree to introduce our guest.
Well, good morning to everybody. We're fortunate to have Dr. Richard Peltier here with us virtually to give us a kind of an update presentation. Dr. Peltier is an associate professor within the Department of Environmental Health Science up in the University of Massachusetts. At the Peltier Aerosol Lab, they investigate the specific chemical components of ambient particulate matter that have a significant effect on human health. So we're happy to have you with us this morning, Dr. Peltier, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be a part of your meeting and help explain some of the science that's going on here. It's a complicated and messy story that's still unrolling across the United States and frankly across the world. And it's an issue that affects lots of communities. It's not just Smyrna, it's not just Atlanta or Covington, it's Chicago, it's Denver, it's even here in New England. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction of myself because it provides some context of who I am. I have a PhD in atmospheric chemistry, and for those of you who have Googled me, you'll see that that PhD came from the North Avenue Trade School about 10 miles to your southeast. I graduated in 2007, and what I trained to do is look at the chemical components of air pollution, looking at the different chemical makeup of pollution, both traditional kind of outdoor stuff that you see from power plants and cars and trucks and those kinds of things. But for the past 10 or 12 years, I've been working on this field of exposure science, and that is to understand how air pollution impacts you and I, how it gets from a tailpipe or a stack, it transforms in the environment and it gets into you and I and causes some kind of health effect or some kind of damage, or not sometimes. I'm the deputy editor-in-chief of one of the Nature Springer journals called the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology. So I see all kinds of exposure science papers from very different disciplines, including those that are produced by industry, produced by academics, produced by government agencies, and so forth. As you mentioned, I'm an associate professor. I've been here for about 10 years at UMass, where it is very cold this early morning up here in New England. But if you talk about what I do for a living, it's really to say what parts of air pollution make us sick. Is it the chemical components? Is it the size? Is it the duration of an exposure? What is it that makes us sick? I do list at the bottom my last 5 years of funding. It's all from kind of standard grant resources, National Science Foundation, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but none of the work I do is actually specific to ethylene oxide. You may find that there are very few experts in ethylene oxide, not that because ethylene oxide is a new chemical, it's been around for a long time, but its importance was reemphasized only recently as something of a public health hazard. There are some folks who do ethylene oxide research, but the vast majority of them are occupational scientists, people who are interested in occupational exposure, somebody who's working in the industry and being exposed to extreme levels, epidemiologists and so forth, including some at Emory just down the road. So how did we get here? A quick narrative and kind of a context for this story, and it really is driven from a phase change in how we evaluate ethylene oxide, and I abbreviate ethylene oxide as ETO, as many of you have. In 2016, IRIS, which is it's a risk assessment database put together by the EPA, they have to reevaluate the relative risk of all these different chemicals that we monitor in the world. And in 2016, a new IRIS reclassification for ethylene oxide was released, and it turns out that it was viewed as much more potent in terms of causing cancer because the state of science had caught up and learned a lot over the past 10 or 15 years through different research projects. As a result, it became a known carcinogen, which kind of changes the game a little bit in how we treat this chemical. There are lots of chemicals out there floating in the world, maybe 100,000 that are in a typical urban environment, that are used for industry, that are used for different manufacturing processes, whatever it happens to be, and we know very little about most of them. But it turns out that we did evaluate ethylene oxide. I was not part of that review, by the way, so I'm an independent body looking at this data, but it's pretty clear and pretty sound that ethylene oxide is quite potent and quite carcinogenic, and is likely to lead to cancer over somebody's life course. As a result of this change in 2016, a NADA cancer risk assessment was released. This is a kind of a countywide assessment of where there's potential harm for carcinogens and other air pollutants, and it caused these hotspots to show up on these maps, showing that there are particular communities in the world, or in the United States at least, that are likely to have increased risks of cancer. And most of that risk was driven by this change in reclassification of ethylene oxide. And so as a result, you had a lot of citizens who were very concerned about these bright red glowing spots on the maps showing that they're at high risk in their community. And it caused outrage and people were upset, and rightfully so. One of the challenges with ethylene oxide, and I'm sure that this is where it intersects with all of your questions, are that the chemistry that is involved is fairly complicated. This is not straightforward stuff. And you are talking about a relatively a chemical that's old, but we now know how hazardous it can be. And as a result, we have to deal with the risks to something that's frankly unknown to most people. We don't really know that much about it, at least the general public doesn't. But at the same time, it's an incredibly useful compound. It's really effective at what it does in terms of sterilization, but it's also used in manufacturing. And as a result, you have these two or sometimes three forces at play, where you have the public who's concerned about their health, industry who wants to protect this asset, and then you have academics like me kind of in the middle who just try to split the difference and just talk about the science. That's what I'm going to do here. I don't have any particular connection to the ethylene oxide industry or any of the citizen scientists. What my connection to this story is actually through something that I do kind of as not a side gig, but something that I think is a public service, and that is I work with a lot of journalists to explain complicated science so that they can write their stories in ways that everybody understands it. And the Atlanta stories, the Covington and Smyrna, are something that I did participate in the past few months, working with a variety of reporters at the AJC and WebMD and others, trying to get this story correct. So let's talk about ethylene oxide itself. It lasts a really long time in the environment. It has what's called a high volatility, which means it evaporates really quickly, kind of like acetone and nail polish remover. And it lasts for a very long time in the environment, on the order of 60, 70, 100 days. That is, if you took a molecule of ethylene oxide and released it from your home, it would circle the planet several times before it's destroyed. What that means is that for all of the ethylene oxide that's being released in the world, everywhere for that matter, not just in your community, but everywhere, this ethylene oxide is spinning around the planet at any given time. As a result, we see that there's what we call a rural background concentration. And that varies with season and time. And it's on the order of, I put here the values here that we typically see, on the order of about 0.2 to 0.4 micrograms per cubic meter. You don't need to know any of the science behind this, but know that the value of what we typically see in an urban environment is on that order. It can be a little lower, it can be a little bit higher, but generally speaking, that's what we see. When you move into an urban environment where you have more sources of potential ethylene oxide, people who smoke cigarettes, cars and trucks, other industries that aren't permitted, you do see a slight increase in concentration in a typical urban environment. And that's on the order of about 0.4, 0.5 micrograms. So you see this slight bump in concentration. So the concentration in an urban environment is usually a little bit higher than a rural background environment. That's not surprising to us. We often see that in the air pollution world. Now, ethylene oxide itself is known as something that's genotoxic. And without getting into the weeds of the science and biology, what this tells me is that ethylene oxide directly damages DNA and RNA in a living organism or a pathogen. Now, that's actually what makes it so effective. If you had a pathogen on, say, a catheter that you were processing, you can use ethylene oxide to damage that DNA and kill it. So it does a really nice job at doing so. The problem is it also does the same thing to you and I. When we are breathing it in, it is impacting us and it's causing direct toxicity to our genes. And as a result, it is linked through epidemiology to very specific cancers, breast cancer and blood cancers, but it's also known as a neurotoxic. Now that's a little bit different than a cancer. Neurotoxic means that you have an impact on your neurological systems or your nerves, but that's generally only happens at extremely high concentrations. So typically you wouldn't see the general community having neurotoxic endpoints. You'd see somebody who was working in the industry who maybe was in an industrial accident, for example, you might see a neurotoxic event. What we worry about mostly with something like ethylene oxide is the long-term cancer effects in the community, because those effects are observed at much lower concentrations, the types of concentrations you might see in a typical community where you have an ethylene oxide source. Now, how do we measure it? And I know you've done, you had GHD doing some measurements, Georgia EPD is doing measurements. The vast majority of samples are produced by sample canisters. These are these polished stainless steel canisters that are evacuated to have a vacuum inside of them. You crack them open for a period of time and they grab a sample. That sample can take 6 hours to capture or sometimes 24 hours. And then you transport that lab back to, you transport that canister back to your laboratory and stick it on a really expensive piece of instrument and assess how much ethylene oxide or other compounds are in that canister. The problem is you've captured everything that's in that airshed, that environment, including other contaminants that are unrelated to what you're interested in looking at. As a result, you have to be very careful with how you quantify, how you actually capture the amount of ethylene oxide in that canister. There's what's known as interference and deconvolution errors. And as a result, there can be some pitfalls with that. And sometimes it can lead to erroneous data. The EPA has what they call their compendium methods, and these are gold standard methods to kind of put an idea of what this is like. It's kind of the Ford Taurus of measurements. It's reliable, it's consistent, nothing flashy though. EPA, in order for a state like Georgia EPD to produce measurements of ethylene oxide, they must follow by law the EPA compendium methods. I don't know if GHD did or not. I've looked for acknowledgments that they follow compendium methods, but I haven't seen it. Maybe I could be corrected. Maybe I'm wrong on that, and I'd be happy to talk about that. I just don't know. But the problem is, and this is my view of the GHD method measurements, the ones that I observed, largely through some news coverage that I helped them with, is that many of these measurements were collected at locations that were fairly far away from the facility that you're worried about. And they often were capturing upwind concentrations. The issue is, and this is something that we often see in empirical measurement world, is that if you don't want to find something, don't look for it. And I'm not saying that GHD did that or that your contract did that, but I am concerned that some of the measurements were probably not quite looking for the things that they needed to look for. And I'll explain what I mean in a few minutes. One thing I will notice is you do have to be very careful with data. This is a really complicated story where you have lots of complicated information presented in very different ways. Here's just a simple example. This is something I use when I teach about data visualization. This is completely unrelated to ethylene oxide, but you can see clearly right here that the interest rates of this particular data set haven't changed over the years. But when you start to drill down into it, you can get a very different story just by how you present the data. So it's really easy to manipulate understanding with the way you present data. And we have to be very, very careful with doing so. And we have to be very open with our data and show everything that we possibly can. Now, ethylene oxide, as I mentioned, is it's a global pollutant. It's essentially everywhere. And it is really a combination at any given place on Earth of the global background the mixed local sources from your community, from your neighbor burning brush in their backyard, whatever it might be, and any high concentration point sources like a sterilization plant. And the issue is because of that complexity, it really depends on where you collect your samples. You can answer different questions, or worse, you can answer the questions differently based on how you collect your samples. And again, I'm not trying to accuse GHD of doing this, but if you were to measure only upwind of a location, or you're to measure poorly, you might come to different conclusions based on the data that you collected. And so the models that Georgia EPD are following, they're slow and steady, but they're the right ones to do. They're the right ones that can answer the kinds of questions you need to address. Now, this is from Willowbrook in Illinois. There's a clear impact here where when the state of Illinois closed this particular facility, you saw these very spiky data. But what I really want to show is not the spikes here of concentration of ethylene oxide, but what I want to show you is the vast majority of measurements at these same locations where spikes occurred were very similar to the concentrations that you observed after the plant was shut down. What this illustrates to me, at least, is that for any given location, even a location that you suspect is going to have a great signal for measuring ethylene oxide, just perfectly downwind, for example, there are times when you're going to take samples and it's going to be near zero. It's going to be measuring a background concentration. So we can't fall into the idea that just because one particular measurement shows that there might not be a problem, we come to the conclusion that there is no problem. And so that's why I wanted to show this. Spiky data is really hard to interpret. And it's really, it might look impressive to see a big, tall spike, but you have to look at the data judiciously and thoughtfully and start to tease apart the data to tell the story that you're trying to tell. Now, this was relatively recent, a few months ago. This is the plans, and again, I've never been to this facility. I haven't been to the Atlanta area in quite some time, but this is the report on negative air enclosure for the Sterigenics plant. And the concern that community activists have, as well as we in the science world, are not the ability to capture and retain ethylene oxide from the chambers themselves. This is just a map of the facility where the purple color on the right, that's where the chambers are located. And the minus signs are a measurement of negative air pressure. So in the purple area, you'd have a really high negative pressure that's capturing all of these emissions and sending them to a scrubber. We're not so concerned about the emissions coming out of the chamber itself. The chambers use a variety of scrubbers to reduce ethylene oxide going up the stack. They're fairly well characterized. There are always, things happen. There are sometimes failures of equipment and instrumentation, but the vast majority of the ethylene oxide that goes out from a chamber is captured appropriately. I think the biggest concern, and this is still very much an unknown, are what kinds of ethylene oxide are coming from all of these other rooms. Because the process, to my understanding of ethylene oxide sterilization, is you move a product into the chamber for 30 minutes, an hour, a couple of hours, you sterilize it, you let it ventilate for a little while, and then you move it to an aeration room where you let it vent out. And to date, most facilities have just let it vent to room air or to outside air, allowing this ethylene oxide to aerate into the community. The facility at Sterigenics here has decided, and rightfully so, to put in a negative air enclosure system in place. That is to capture the air in this facility and send it to a separate scrubbing system. That should work. That would be my expectation, but you have to make sure it works before you have to make sure that you have proof showing that this works, that there are no what are so-called fugitive emissions. So in order to assess this, there are a couple of different strategies that you might consider. The idea of what Georgia EPD is doing using concentric proximity monitoring, that is setting up monitoring networks in close proximity to the facility on the order of about a quarter of a mile or less in a circle, and then having a wider circle and then a wider circle still really does allow you, and unfortunately it's for a long period of time, that does allow you to assess whether there's a fugitive emission coming from this facility or some kind of leak or something along those lines. And those methods have to follow these EPA methods, this forward torus of analytical methods. You can consider things like mobile sampling, but I will warn you that's very expensive. Mobile sampling are very sophisticated instruments that can be put into a vehicle, it can be positioned in a location. You have to be just downwind of a facility, and you can quantify what's going on in that airshed. But that's expensive and very hard to do. And then the last step is this better emissions accounting by these facilities. We know what goes into these chambers, their Clean Air Act permits prescribe precisely what they can do, how much ethylene oxide they can use in a given year, what kind of scrubbing system they have to use, and what the efficiency of that scrubbing system happens to be. But what we don't do a good job of is accounting what's coming out of those other facilities within that plant. And what I'm talking about is these aeration rooms, the warehouses, the loading docks where product is sitting and still continuing to aerate, even if it's met its prescribed aeration time. We don't really know what's coming out of those materials after they've been sanitized or sterilized and while they're awaiting shipment to their final destination. But that requires a political decision or political move. And that's way outside of my wheelhouse, and I leave it to the people who are much better at politics than I am. Now, this is a terrible, these are lots of questions. These are the kinds of questions that I tend to entertain, whether it's from the Atlanta area or Chicago or Denver. I'm just going to leave these on the screen for you to read. I'm not going to go through them because it's just a lot of information here. I want to make sure that I have enough time to answer any of the questions that you might have related to ethylene oxide. I will give you the best of my knowledge that I can, but I will also admit that when I don't know something, I will stop and say, I don't know, because I don't know all the answers to this. As I mentioned, ethylene oxide is kind of a new problem that we've just realized is a problem. And as a result, there's not that much expertise out there on ethylene oxide as a molecule. And so we're all figuring this out as we go along, but we all have to figure this out because this is important for public health. Ethylene oxide causes cancer. We know that. We can see that in lab animals and workers and other humans, but we don't know what the impact is to particular communities, especially for a molecule that's so small. It's undetectable by a person without a sophisticated analyzer, and it's essentially everywhere. It's a really complicated story, and it still continues to be complicated, and I think we've got a little ways to go. I'm going to switch to the next slides. There's a few more of these types of questions, and again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may wish to entertain.
I'd like to turn it over to any committee members who have any questions of our guest.
Mr. Chair, I have just a couple. Dr. Peltier, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
So early in your presentation, just a couple questions. You had shared with us, kind of a general comparison of background levels, both rural, I think at 0.02 to 0.04 mics per cubic meter, and then the urban sample. Can you help us understand where those numbers came from?
Sure. So the rural sampling, the background sampling, is coming from the National Air Trends Labs. These are the EPA sites that are typically in background locations that don't have local sources. It's the NNATS, that's the acronym, where there's chemical speciation that's happening in rural background locations. And these are long-term data sets that have been collected for a long period of time. There's also some other studies, academic studies that have looked at the same kinds of things, like in the middle of the ocean, on islands, those kinds of things. The urban background stuff is a little more squishy because we do see that there are some places where there's higher levels of ethylene oxide, but we don't know what causes them. We don't know where they're coming from, specifically at least. And the value of 0.4 to 0.5, that's looking at what we would, when in the data sets I've looked at, both in the Chicago area as well as the Atlanta area, when you look at upwind of an urban facility, for example, the Sterigenics plant, if you're taking a canister sampler that was upwind of that facility, that is, it's not being impacted by that facility at all, you typically see this increase in concentration of 1/10 to 2/10 of a microgram per cubic meter. And we attribute that to all of the diversity of sources, the fact that we have human activities nearby, the cars and the trucks and the barbecue grills and all of these things that can potentially emit ethylene oxide in much lower concentrations. And so there's no certainty to the fact that it's 0.4 to 0.5 micrograms in an urban environment, but that's generally that would be my opinion of what you'd expect to see in an urban background.
Okay, and then just one final from me. You had mentioned also in your presentation the work from the Georgia EPD. Can you give us kind of an understanding on the data that we've collected here in the Cobb County, Smyrna area, as compared to the data that was collected by the EPD from South Georgia?
I describe the data as noisy, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, a negative way. But I know that there was a lot of interference with something called isobutane, which is another commonly encountered gas that's out in the world. That tells me that there are some differences with the method, because the compendium method that EPA follows generally wouldn't have that kind of interference. So as a result, it makes me a little more skeptical of the data. But again, these are complicated measurements, and GHD is a giant laboratory that has quite a bit of capacity to do this kind of work. I don't know if they've followed these compendium methods or not. I'd love it if somebody could tell me if they were. That'd be really helpful to know. But I would say that there were times that I would dispute the conclusion that GHD made that said that there was really no impact from this facility. But I wouldn't say that the impact was in the observations were full of fireworks. There were certainly increases in concentration that are probably attributed to a high point source. I would assume that would be the Sterigenics plant. It could be others, but you have to dig into the data to make that analysis, and I haven't been able to do that yet.
Thank you, Chief. Jennifer Bennett?
Yeah, this is mostly a general question.
Can you hear her?
Yeah, I can't really hear that one.
Speak as loud as you can, Jennifer.
All right, so can you hear me now?
Yeah, a little bit. I'll concentrate.
I'll try to repeat the question for you.
Okay, so you mentioned gas. Are there other industries that might have off-gassing that's similar to like the gas grills that contribute?
If you didn't hear, she's asking, she says gas grills are a contributor to the background levels. Is there other industries or other sources that contribute to that number?
Sure. So there are other industries that use ethylene oxide in their processing, plastics manufacturing, those kinds of things. And certainly barbecue grills, diesel engines, those kinds of things do emit some levels of ethylene oxide. But there is an important difference, though, and that is that to fire up your barbecue grill in your backyard does not require a clean air permit. That's not a regulated activity, whereas using a sterilizer is. And so there is a difference between those two sources. Are there other major permitted sources? I don't think that there are in the state of Georgia. There are a couple of there's several sterilization plants that use ethylene oxide. There are a couple of hospitals that sterilize things that have these permits. And then there's one or two facilities that uses ethylene oxide that in an industrial process that typically occurs in a chamber, and the emissions are nearly zero because it's reacted away. But that's the hard part of this story, is how do you disentangle one potential emitter that's located in one particular location from all of the other tinier, much smaller sources that are surrounding it, the barbecue grills, the restaurants, the wood fires in your fireplace. And that does make it difficult to do that. That's one of the reasons why this story is so complicated. But again, I point to the fact that those activities, like firing up your barbecue, is not a regulated activity, but sterilizers are. That answer your question?
Thank you. She's shaking her head yes, so you did fine. Mr. Gould?
Thanks for your time today and your expertise. A couple questions for you. So a resident, residents are trying to get their arms around this and understand, the impact, if there is an impact of the Sterigenics plant. So one of the questions I received is, any idea to say how many pounds or the amount of ethylene oxide that needs to be released, say if that's Sterigenics, to correlate that to a microgram measurement? 5 pounds released as an example. Any idea what that would be in a measurement side?
So that's a very complicated question. It's a fairly simple question, but it has a very complicated answer. The problem is when you use, let's say, 5 pounds of ethylene oxide to sterilize a pallet of catheters, maybe 4.9 pounds of that ethylene oxide is going to be consumed in the sterilization process, and then it's going to be captured by the scrubbers in the chamber. So that goes away. The problem is that those catheters may have 1/10 of a pound of ethylene oxide in the metaphorical nooks and crannies of the catheters. As a result, the FDA, before you use a catheter, requires that these things aerate for a period of time. And this aeration of these 0.1 pounds of ethylene oxide occurs on these facilities as well. And depending on where the products are located, will tell you where this stuff is going to come out. The issue is that sometimes these products move around. They sit in 18-wheel trucks, they sit in warehouses that are on site, they sit in warehouses that are off site. And so it gets really hard to track every ethylene oxide molecule. There's no simple way to say, if you use X pounds in your facility, you're going to release a concentration of Y, because the process is so different depending on the products that are being used, where these things are going, who the vendors are that are going to buy them. And so that's the real crux of this story. The other issue is that when we talk about regulation for something like ethylene oxide, we're talking about lifetime cancer risk. They're talking about somebody's exposed to this for their entire lifetime. The concentrations are exceedingly low that are allowed because of the lifetime risks of cancer. And as a result of this 2016 reevaluation of ethylene oxide, these concentrations were even more conservative with making sure that these concentrations stay below that threshold level. And so there's no simple way to answer that question of how many pounds of a maximum concentration can be used safely, because it depends on the process that's occurring in that facility.
Okay, thank you.
How's that for an answer, Mr. Gould?
Let me concentrate on that. Let's see. Hey, so ethylene oxide obviously is a very effective at sterilization, right? I think you called it a genotoxin because it mutates cells and does things that are really good for that process, but obviously have negative consequences. What other are there other sterilization techniques out there that you could maybe, I know it's not your area of expertise, but can you mention a few that you may know of?
Sure. There are a lot, and they're widely used in the medical industry. Gamma radiation, blast everything with the equivalent of X-rays. Steam, you can steam these things and get them sterile. The problem is, and this is a manufacturing issue, some of the products that are being sterilized won't tolerate that. If you want to put, say a Band-Aid and sterilize that Band-Aid, or a bandage, I should say, if you put it in steam, it might melt. And so that clearly is not an indicated way to sterilize these products. So it really depends on the product you're trying to sterilize. Some methods of sterilization are appropriate and others are not. I think generally speaking, ethylene oxide is viewed as one of the more utilitarian ways to sterilize because it doesn't react with the products themselves very much. But the problem is it's got these kind of carcinogenic endpoints with it. And so it's making it a little bit less desirable. Related to sterilization, this is something that not related directly to this story, but I do a lot of work on N95 face masks. And one of the methods that was pitched to reprocess and decontaminate these face masks was ethylene oxide. But the FDA said no, that was not an appropriate way to do that because of its carcinogenicity. It would be inappropriate to sanitize a face mask with ethylene oxide and then allow a medical worker to wear this thing because of this carcinogenic risk that we have. So it would be really effective at sterilizing a mask. It would do a really great job of it. But the problem is it has these long-term endpoints that you would discover a few years from now if you were to be exposed to it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Sure.
Any other committee members here or who have joined us virtually who have any questions or comments for Dr. Peltier? All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And this whole process is about making sure that our citizens here in Smyrna and around are safe, and we're continuing this discussion, trying to get all of the information that we can from people that know what they're talking about, and just can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Oh, you're
Chief,
very
is there
welcome.
anything that you want to add? Okay. Like I said, we'll have another meeting of the Air Quality Oversight Committee, hopefully in conjunction with air quality testing results that we get from EPD, and we'll send out a notice for that. This has been recorded and will be posted on our city website. So if you have, if there's any questions that you see on here that you'd like answered, we'll put contact information up for you, Dr. Peltier. Is that okay?
Sure.
Email contact. Okay, great. Thank you again.
All right.
And if there's no other comments or questions, we'll call this meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.